just by way of introduction, Rutendo Ngara is here, is an African Indigenous knowledge systems holder and transdisciplinary scholar in research, and she's co-founder of Ancient Wisdom Africa. So great to have you here with us, Rutendo. John Perkins is, well, a world-renowned economist, whistleblower, and author of the bestseller Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which is a book that incredibly moved and opened my mind, as well as so many millions of people around the world. And he's founder and board member of Dream Change and co-founder of the Pachamama Alliance. And Manish, who is, now we can see him here, is a leading voice for the regeneration of diverse local knowledge systems, cultural imaginations, and the de-schooling of our lives. And he's the co-founder and coordinator of Shikshantar, the People's Institute for Rethinking Education and Development, and the co-founder of Swaraj University, as well as many other incredibly pioneering approaches to basically a different form of education, and also helped to launch the global Ecoversities network. So this is the conversation we'll have. I'm author of a couple of books the last few years, one called The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe, one called The Patterning Instinct, and I'm working on a book on ecological civilization right now. So let's turn to you, Sam, and maybe you can take us into the film, and then we can engage in the panel discussion with all of us later. Thank you.
So welcome back, everyone. Wow, that was such a powerful film. I'm just feeling so excited right now and so inspired. I want to invite John Perkins to share some reflections about the film. You want to go, John?
Sure. Well, thanks, Manish. It was a beautiful film, beautifully done, marvelous. And it struck me as I'm listening to this. I actually came back from that conference in England about a year ago, a little less, thinking about, well, what can we do here? And I live on an island of about 25,000 people near Seattle, Bainbridge Island. And, the question comes up, if not here, then where can we actually create an ecological civilization? So a group of people here, we've started a program that's basically based on asking people to write stories, including high school kids and grade school kids and everybody, as to, we're looking at the year 2040. And we now on this island, we are an ecological civilization. What actions did we take to get here? Because one of the questions that keeps coming up, one of the issues that keeps coming up, is people talking about this is what should be done. This is what we ought to do. This is what we need to do. And frankly, I'm so sick of hearing those words. And one of the stipulations in the terms of writing the short story is don't use those words. Assume that we are an ecological civilization. It's 2040. What actions did we take to get here? For example, we formed a local utility company, a public utility company, but it wasn't just buying electricity and wheeling it from someplace else. It owned solar panels on basically every roof. So, I've got a solar panel on my roof, but I don't own it. They own it, they maintain it, they install it, they invest in the capital. I don't have to do any of that. And then they meter me. And that was one of the ideas that come up. And another one is, you get rid of cars on our main streets and plant the roads that are now roads with vegetables. We can do that in the climate we have here. Now, I grew up in New Hampshire where that wouldn't be quite as easy some of the year. But I think the important question for everyone to ask is, what can I do right now in my community? That's one example. But I think that is so essential that we look at what do we each do to take responsibility. If not here, in my community, we all ask ourselves that question, then where? and let's set out to make every community become a model. And I think, you know, this week, if we can all start doing that, doesn't matter whether we're in New York City or London or a small island, you know, in the Pacific, near the Pacific Ocean, we can do it. But we have to start something. We have to take the first step.
Thank you so much, John. Yes, I would. I saw that some people have also said hello into the chats, and I invite you to say that, you know, say hello to everyone, namaste, and where you're from. And also, if you have some questions for the panelists or any reflections also from the movie, you can type them into the chat. And I'm going to invite my sister Rutendo to share some of her reflections.
Thank you so much, Manish, and thank you so much to all the panelists. It's such a pleasure to be here, and also very blessed to have seen the film, which I think has a beautiful weave, you know, looking at the economy and weaving it right back into nature. And I think that's where I come from. You know, really looking at the movement of localization from an indigenous paradigm, and immediately I go into Ubuntu, and there's a particular principle within Ubuntu called Hantu, which is when time and space are collapsed into a single continuum, which of course quantum physics has recently discovered. And I believe that this is what localization does. Localization, it's about knowing the locality and knowing the temporality of any time and space. And this is named in a particular way within Southern Africa. So when a place is named, it's named according to its time and space. And when it's named according to its time and space, it takes us back to the times of their ancestors. And I believe when we were going back into nature through the film, we were going back to what was it that our ancestors were speaking about. Now, in the current world order, things are either or. Things are either or. They are a dichotomy where the pawns on the chessboard and the audience are in an unfolding play where forces are forced to choose a side or face attack, as opposed to being what our ancestors knew as both and. And I believe that this is what the localization movement is asking us. What do we mean by both and? And both and is challenged in this time when polarization of society is being seen. We see it now, obviously, with the battles for leadership in all the elections of 2020 to 24, where almost half of the world's population is going to the polls to make this either or choice, you know, where we're being pushed into bounded spaces with little room left for the freedom of mind or freedom of heart or freedom of will. And I believe that when there's freedom of will and freedom of heart and freedom of mind, we do not have space, you know, to look at all the topical things, you know, for instance, that the planet is still warming, the climate is still changing, the water sources are still waning, food reserves are still diminishing, you know, communicable and non-communicable diseases are still sustaining, poverty is reigning, inequality is dwelling, you know, all the ills imposed upon humanity by modernity are prevailing. Yeah, we're in a time of turning, the veil is thin, the integrity is thinning. You know, what is it that we're doing, you know, to go back into that localization, time and space where it collapses, where we listen to the voices of the ancestors? And what is it that our collective ancestors said? How did they record them? For instance, here in Southern Africa, in the caves, you know, in code and the sculptings of our great warriors, our great seers, our great sanusis, our great mondoros, as we call them. You know, they knew what was written in the patterns of the universe, and they knew that everything was written in the stars. They knew that when forces were at play, they did not trap themselves into polarizations. They did not trap themselves into either or. They did not trap themselves into a dichotomized view of the world that we have in the modern world. You know, they took the practice of circumspection. They taught us to step back, to take a deep breath and survey the entirety of the terrain. They took things apart, looking at outer differences in what they called segregation. They put things together again, looking at the outer similarities in congregation. They went in depth, looking at the inner differences in analysis. They integrated the core, looking at the inner similarities in synthesis. They were both analytical, synthetical. They were critical in their approach. They sought truth that would withstand the scrutiny of the cosmic trickster and the scales of divine law. And I believe that if we can, through the localization movement, go back to the ways of our ancestors, we may be able to find questions that open up far more possibilities for being able to bring about, I believe, a movement that is where the whole is greater than the sum of its individual parts.
Thank you, Rutendo. I'd maybe ask you to take another and share about your powerful work with sacred sites and how that's part of the localization movement, integral, critical part of the movement.
So I think once again, with that whole idea of how time and space are collapsed, I'm with a group of Indigenous knowledge holders, different groups of Indigenous knowledge holders, one of them within a collective called the Earthrise Collective, where we have different Indigenous knowledge holders, many of whom are activists, really fighting for their lands and their spaces and the sacredness of the spaces, the sacredness of natural sacred spaces. Because we understand that sacred spaces are the lungs of the planet. Sacred spaces are the meridians of the planet. Sacred spaces hold codes, they hold memories, they amplify that which, when we listen to nature, which they concentrate, we're able to perhaps see how to be in interrelated interconnectedness and interdependence with all that is. And so with some of the groups, we have work that we do where we go to listen to the sacred places, coming from different cosmovisions, whether we're coming from those coming from the South Americas, those coming from Siberia, those coming from Maori, from New Zealand, or Aotearoa, those coming from Africa, where we come together seeking a common cosmovision that's rooted in understanding what nature is saying. And what is amazing is that when we do this, we realize that irrespective of our tongue or our languages or the differences in our cultures, when we're listening to the same source, with the same ear that is interdependent, interconnected, and interrelated, we're able to come together to find the alternatives that may be viable for the future or the local futures that we're seeking to bring forth.
Thank you so much, Sister Rutendo. I would urge everyone, there's a follow-up to the film, The Power of the Local, which is also being released today, and which will have very, very many, over 30 powerful examples of beautiful movements that are connected to the localization movement around the world. And I'm going to invite Jeremy now to jump in the conversation.
Sure. Yeah, well, thanks, guys. So inspiring to hear both, John, what you were saying about that, bringing people's ideas right up now, how we made that happen, and to hear what you were saying, Rutendo, just totally moving me. And yeah, I just kind of wanted to pick up on the theme, Rutendo, you were just talking about, in terms of so many different groups from around the world coming together and then sharing these core values. And to me, that's a real source of great hope for what's possible, because the reality is that as human beings, we evolved in a particular niche, and we evolved with core values, values for connection with community, and values to be a meaningful part of our community, to be relating to the natural world. And it's as if the system right now has to basically condition everyone from infancy, which they do with TV advertising and everything else, to kind of lose those values, to create a mask over them. But what is so powerful is this realization that pretty much everyone born into this world, billions of people, actually want a beautiful future for themselves. So it's that place of connecting with them that gets to be so important. And one thing I'd like to really share around that, and it kind of relates a lot to, I love the arc of the film, the way it moved. It kind of went into the depth, just how screwed up things are right now, and then allowed us to see what is actually possible from there. And I'm working on this book, as I mentioned. It's going to be called Ecological Civilization: How We Can Create a Flourishing Future. And that also follows a similar arc where the first part looks at why, you know, these ideas so many people have, kind of maybe green growth ideas or different concepts out there. So we fix this and somehow everything will be okay. That is not going to work. We need to recognize, um, ultimately, I think the key thing I took from doing the deep research into what's wrong with our system is, believe it or not, to realize actually we all talk about this broken system. In fact, the system isn't broken. The system is doing exactly what it was intended to do. As the film mentioned, it began with colonialism, Vandana Shiva talked about, and colonialism and capitalism both initiated right around the same time in early modern Europe around the 17th century. And that was the beginning of the limited liability corporation, the progenitor of these massive transnational corporations right now. All these ideas came from the same place. Basically, it's kind of the code of capitalism is extraction and exploitation. And why I get so excited by this idea of an ecological civilization, we could call it whatever we want, like a life-affirming future, whatever, but it's this realization we have to change that underlying operating system. And it's clear what we change it to one that simply sets the conditions for all beings to thrive on a regenerated earth. And as I'm writing this book, just like we saw in that second half of the film, I've been so inspired by realizing, and this is part of what I'm going to be trying to do in this book, communicating, is that every aspect of what we call civilization, whatever, every aspect of what we are on this earth today, whether it's education or technology or infrastructure or agriculture, you name it. There are people right now actually doing the work and thinking about what it would mean to really transform to that life-affirming future and actually doing it. In fact, Manish is a perfect example of when looking at education, I'll be mentioning some of the amazing work that Manish is doing there, rethinking what it actually means to, rather than starting from the system of destruction and exploitation, what it actually means to develop a life-affirming future. So that's what I find so exciting. And that's what I feel that film today was leading us to, realizing that there's this great quote from a systems scientist called Ilya Prigogine, talked about like what you were mentioning about Rutendo, about how we're in this time of turning right now. And he talked about when a system is in that place, far from equilibrium, in that transition, he says small islands of coherence in that sea of chaos have the capacity to lift the entire system to a higher order. And that's what I loved in this film. It's pointing to those small islands of coherence, those sacred spaces, Rutendo, that you were talking about. Those when we engage in them and we look at what others are doing and then connect them up together, that's what gives us the opportunity to transform to that different future. So thank you.
Thank you, Brother Jeremy. So good to see you. Yeah, I would just want to say a few words. I think was very happy the film brought up education, and I think that for me, at least, the key to much of this movement is to actually reimagine education, and in that I would talk about a lot about unlearning as as a critical dimension of it, because much of what we've learned in the last few hundred years is actually day by day proving to be more and more problematic and even wrong in some cases, about who we are or about how the world works. Um, and I think that I mean I love John's term, economic hitman. I would call myself I was an education hitman before, and with many international organizations, and I kind of feel like the first thing in education that we really need to look at is that the entire education system is designed to produce self-hate, to make us feel really shitty about who we are, about it. We're not intelligent enough, we're not cool enough, we're not beautiful enough, we're not good looking, we're not we're not competitive enough, and and so I think that's actually really great for consumerism and for growth, because we look for external remedies to this all of the time. And so I think the first thing is we need to move into this unlearning around, to start to see ourselves very differently, and our gifts and our unique talents that each of us brings to the world. And I don't think the current education model helps us do that very well, for most people, even those who are the so-called winners in the system. High levels of anxiety and perfectionism, and fear all the time about many things. So that, and I think also that um, our much of our cultural imagination has also been uh, has has been shaped by the educational system, in the one sense that I think where we're stuck in many of the cases looking for, uh, in a model of technological utopianism, solutions which are still grounded in that most of the funding, for example, in climate is going either for technological utopian solutions, or for market-based solutions. More and more faith that the market will be able to solve all of our problems. Even things that, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, are fundamentally grounded in these two mythologies that continue to dominate much of the discourse. And so I think unlearning that, freeing our imagination from these two, dominant solution based directions, I think is very critical for us. And I think the one other thing is, the third thing I'll just say is unlearning. There's a tremendous, it was mentioned briefly in the film, focus on the individual being the problem, the individual being the solution even. So I think there is a role for the individual, but the individual that is connected to life, not the separated individual that we have constructed through modernity. And even our politics is very much grounded in the individual today, I think. And I think, the invitation, I think, is to how do we start to, and this is one of my own learning edges, is how do we see politics that is beyond the political parties, that is maybe multipolar, that is actually inviting us to sit with even the so-called enemy. The corporates also want to actually eat good food. They also care about the future of their children. They also live in a place, and they would like that place not to be polluted. And I think inviting those kinds of people, or same thing with government officials, inviting them into this localization movement. I think I've had tremendous success inviting people into like food festivals and bringing them outside of their institutional labels into the localization movement. So I think that is beautiful. And we have, I think, the last thing I'll just say right now is that there's a tremendous movement happening. Ecoversities is part of that movement of people who are trying to reimagine education, and not just adding another course, like not putting a localization course or mindfulness course into the existing model, but actually really re-looking at the spaces we occupy and the ways, the processes, the pedagogies we use. Um, and, so we have grandmothers universities, or we have forest universities, have river universities or farmer universities. And so many things which are outside of the imagination, even of how we've constructed classrooms and universities, that is part of the imagination that has to be freed. And I think all of these movements are really grounded. I would just share one word in Hindi, seva. Seva as a direct challenge to the paradigm of extraction, accumulation, and competition as our, reason for being on this earth. But actually, do we come with this divine mission to serve our deepest purpose, our deepest possibilities, serve our communities, serve the planet. And I think that's where we have to open up a different kind of education too. So thanks for that. And I'm going to invite some questions. Nobody's typed any in.
We have some questions in the Q&A, I see.
You see that? Okay.
Yeah.
Can you read that out? Help me out.
Yes, absolutely, sure. So I saw, I mean, just the first question came from VPE Letterkenny Donegal. How is it possible for money to make money when it is inanimate, unlike life? John, I see you looking coming alive.
John, jump in.
You've been such an expert in this area. Why don't you
Well,
lead us?
it's possible because we write the laws that make it possible. We elect people who do, and we go along with the system. You know, under a perfect world, you wouldn't have this type of centralized banking system that gains a lot of interest off creating money, but some form of barter that makes barter easy is necessary. Money in and of itself is not a bad thing. You know, if you get something to exchange, like, you know, this originally started, we have a word in the United States for our dollar, which is buck. And the reason we call it a buck is because the biggest trading item of trade back around the turn of the century, around 1800, were deer skins. And they were sent to Europe. They were used in so many things, furniture, clothes, all kinds of things. And a deer skin became worth what was written out as $1. And so $1 was a buck. And, you know, if you kept that sort of system, then instead of having to send deer skins to people like, I got to get a haircut. So here's 3 of my deer skins, you know. If instead of that, I could just give the guy 3 pieces of paper, that made life easy. But then the whole process of the central banking system came into play, which you know, created this business of earning interest off these and controlling the money through some sort of fake standard. And that's something we obviously need to get away from. The question is, how are we going to do it? And people sometimes think cryptocurrency will do it. That may be one of the possibilities. We're certainly using a lot of digital currency today. All of us for a long time have been using credit cards and so forth. So it's really, it regards a deep amount of thinking. But then again, you have to come up against the institutions that are so wedded to the current system. And that is where we really get into problems. Once again, we can go to local currencies. So here on this island, we could create a currency that we use in trading with ourselves here, at least, that wouldn't help us if we wanted to trade with one of you someplace else, however. Sorry to go into so much discussion. I think too many words. What do you think, Jeremy?
I was just thinking, perhaps just to add to what you're saying, is just this realization that this is actually the defining principle of capitalism. That, I mean, if you think of what capitalism actually is, it's a system that gives primacy to capital above anything else on life, on the earth. And the notion of that is capital has to make more money. The very drive of capitalism is no matter how much you do, no matter how much you make, you have to make more. Otherwise, your shareholders will go somewhere else. So it's like this, it's the actual system itself is designed to consume and consume at a faster and faster rate. And that's why the system itself has to change. It's something that has even been called omnicide. This notion that it's not just an ecocide. It's like ultimately it won't stop until everything is consumed. And so one of the challenges to realize that is that you can't just slow it down. You can't say, oh, let's just have a no growth capitalism, because actually the system is designed, it has to, just like some sharks species, they have to keep going just to keep breathing. Capitalism has to keep growing just to keep going, which is why starting from localization, just like you say, local currencies, starting to sort of sidestep, almost kind of create these different forms of being, like commons-based forms of organization from within the system, and doing it separately is a way so that if and when the system ultimately it basically just collapses under its own contradictions, we can start to have created these seeds of alternative ways of being from within, so that maybe those can then begin to grow more powerfully.
I was just going to add something also. I think that it's not money creating more money, it's actually banks printing more money, and how they're being allowed to by governments is an important thing to understand. And I think that behind this, we need to understand the whole debt, and that money is being printed against debt, and that much of the pressure to keep growing is because we have to pay back the debt. It's under a compounded interest regime, and that the pressure to, so unless we actually also bring these conversations around the debt and the compounded interest system into the localization movement more and more, I think we're being pushed in the direction, even though a lot of people today are waking up and understanding that it's not a direction that is healthy for us as individuals or the planet.
Mm.
And I think that somebody's raised in the next question too is how do we measure wealth? Because I think this idea that we're valuing this abstraction of money more than clean air or clean water or clean food is kind of the ultimate absurdity that we're living in right now. So our entire fundamental system of valuation has to be shifted, I think, and that's part of what I think the movement is trying to open up.
What was the question that you just raised, Manish?
Oh, I'm saying somebody said, are there localization projects changing their accounting tools to measure true wealth rather than conform to the wealth measuring tools of the death economy?
Yeah, are there systems like that? And certainly, as Rutendo probably knows, there are. And indigenous cultures have their systems. As people probably know, I spent a great deal of time in the Amazon with indigenous cultures there, and increasingly they're becoming more and more dependent on our type of currency. But I started working there in 1968. I was a Peace Corps volunteer for 3 years, and back then there were no currencies whatsoever. In fact, I was sent in to help them form credit and savings co-ops. That's what the Peace Corps sent me in to do, because I'd graduated from business school, and I immediately found that there was no way that could happen because there was no currency, and you can't save bananas very well, or papayas, which was the means of trade, or buckskins, for that matter. So certainly the idea of local economies it's a very old one. And I think it's important to recognize that we all come from cultures that were life economies, not death economies, economies that were localized. For the 200,000 or so years we've been human beings on this planet, most of that time we've lived in life economies. It's only been within the last couple of thousand years that we've moved away from it. So we have that knowledge. It's ingrained in us. And, but the question now is, practically speaking, how do we do this? And again, I think this idea of localized, that we have to do it on a localized basis, each community, my island, your town, your city, whatever. And at the same time, recognize that we're not going to reach perfection. We're still, I've got a cat in the background who's dying to go out. You may hear her. So we've got to move forward as well as we can with the idea, that Voltaire expressed of perfect is the enemy of good. We've got to move toward good and make sure that our own communities, and each of the people who's listening to this, takes responsibility for seeing something happen to move your community more toward this ideal that we're reaching for, and realize in your lifetime you're probably not going to attain the total ideal, but you can get a long way toward it.
I see a question that is written for Manish, but I bet Rutendo's got some real interesting perspectives on it too. It says, so I'll read it out for maybe both of you. It says, in your vision, how can we live and practice Indigenous education in our communities in the face of the globalization of artificial intelligence? And this comes from Instituto Etno in Brazil.
Perhaps I can just go back, as John said, within Indigenous cultures, there are different ways of doing economy. And I live in the most unequal society in the world, with the highest Gini coefficient in South Africa, which is really interesting given that, I'll give an example of my mother's culture, where and a lot of Southern African culture, where currency has traditionally been in the form of the cow, being seen as that which, the currency is around. And so in the village, if there is a family that happens to have more cows, and, there is a family that has less cows, or less wealth, then they hire a herd boy, from the other family, who comes to tend to the cows of the one with more cows. And at the end of the year, that herd boy is given perhaps 2 cows, a male and a female, with the potential of building their own wealth. And over time, we start to see that where one family had many cows and another, didn't, that investment of the pregnant cow, which, keeps, yielding more, then starts to equalize, and wealth is not just in the form of this paper stuff. Wealth is in the form of life, because obviously, the cows, having the cows means that it's how you tend to the land, it's how you tend to the waters, it's how you tend to, to the green, all of that is how wealth is measured. And ultimately wealth is measured in how you celebrate with the cow. When there's great celebrations, it's celebrated with the cow, which is then slaughtered, in some instances, as a celebration of life. So, wealth is not just material. Wealth is also in the coming together of community. And that is all centered around the cow, and in particular pregnant cows, so the feminine being so important. And I think this is part of, kind of where we come from an Indigenous perspective. That education that is gained, from the herd boy. The herd boy is not just learning about how to take care of cows. They're also learning about, a holistic education. They're learning about ecology. They're learning about geology. They're learning about geography. They're learning about investment. They're learning about, all sorts of things just centered around, this notion of the cow. So how do we go back to a nature-based, education? How do we go back to a nature-based economy? I believe would be able to help us to mitigate, this globalization of artificial intelligence, that which is natural as opposed to artificial.
I'm wondering, maybe if we can just go to one final question. Really, I'll just kind of do a compound, if you will, of two questions, but really they become one. One is from Ali Scott, who's talking about wanting to share the film and looking for any suggestions how to use it. And any tried and tested ways of doing this in community to really lead to discussion. And very on a similar vein, Jean Watts asked, what are effective ways of having conversations on core values and assumptions, which feels like such an important point. So maybe, John, I know you've got to go in a moment, and Rutendo, maybe each of us can just share thoughts on that for everyone.
Well, I'll start. I think it's just really important that each of us does it our way. You've got to follow our heart. You've got to, I tell people, ask 5 questions. First one is, what do I most want to do for the rest of my life? And I'd say I want to be a writer. I have a friend who's a carpenter, says I want to work with my hands in wood. Second question, how do you do this in a way that's going to create an ecological civilization? And I would say, I'm going to write about these things. I'm going to try to inspire people. My carpenter friend will say, I'm only going to use sustainable woods, and I'm going to replant trees for all the trees I cut. And then you go on, well, what's stopping you? What's holding you back? And you confront that. And like for the carpenter friend, like my investors, my clients maybe don't want to pay the extra price for sustainable materials. And then the fourth question is, when you confront that obstacle, what message do you get? And the carpenter would get the message, well, I'll tell my clients that the extra price is not a cost, it's an investment in the future. And then the fifth question is, what actions do you take? And you build cabinets with sustainable materials, and you talk about it with your clients and tell them what you're doing. And I think we can, all of us, do that kind of an analysis of what do I really want to do for the rest of my life, because that's the only way we'll be successful. And how do I do this in a way that transforms the death economy to a life economy and creates an ecological civilization? So, my answer would be, work with your community, work with whatever you want, do it in your way. I started a program here that involves writing short stories because I'm a writer and I love to write. But, if you were a plumber, you could do it around all fixing the plumbing in your community and making sure that everybody has good drinkable water without having to buy it in plastic bottles, whatever it is. So follow your heart but do it, take actions. Let's all get out there and do what we most want to do and do it in a way that we can and coordinate that with our neighbors. So I can coordinate my writing with the carpenter and with the plumber and a teacher and a student and a mother and a father, whatever. That's it.
Great. Thanks, John. And Rutendo, do you want to share your thoughts on that too? Effective ways of having conversation on core values and assumptions.
I believe that it's important to have conversations with the more than human world as well, and which would help to feed and to nourish, core values and assumptions. So certainly from an African traditional perspective, conversations are held around or under a tree, and it's not just for the conversation to happen between the humans, but for the conversation to happen with the tree as well. And what can we learn from observing the tree? Because in observing the cycles of the tree, if we sit around that tree through the seasons, there's a lot that we can learn, which will teach us a lot about, core values and assumptions, about how to be in harmony and in resonance with nature, and how to build an economy or a society that is resonant with the power of the tree. So I believe conversations with the more than human world is also important.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks. And
great.
Manish, are you able to?
Can you hear me?
We're not seeing you, but I think we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
I can hear you.
So thank you. Yeah, I think. I think that we have been trained to be ideological rather than dialogical, and so I think that shifting of a lot of the categories and the conventional labels and politics that we use to see the other is part of that, the othering. And I think that there's very simple technologies, ancient technologies of good food, music, dance, silence. We use them very powerfully. Being in climbing a tree, building something together, growing food together, gardening. These are all very ancient technologies, and I think maybe the point is to do this to see each other more than the narrow categories by which we've ascribed to each other, and invite this deeper sense of trust. I think has become more and more important. I think for me is how to build the trust and how to shift these conversations from being, like we're approaching them, we're trying to again approach them through scarcity. And so if we need to fundamentally build this sense of abundance to be able to build alignment and open up new imaginations.
Wow, that's so great, Manish. Thanks. And if I just add a couple points on top of what you just said, Manish, is that thing when we talk with people who don't have the same viewpoints that we do, and because of mainstream culture has such a different way of making sense for people, that happens a lot. And to my mind, it's really important to realize that every one of us, and I spent a big part of my life being conditioned by those ideas and had to rethink them, and recognizing that that's the person we're talking to is not necessarily the other, is on the other side, but we share our hearts. And to my mind, one of the most important things we can try to do is not win a conversation, say, no, you're wrong, this is the way it really is, but just to leave the person curious, leave the person feeling that somebody connected with them and curious about exploring a little bit more about what you might have raised. To me, that's the way we want to engage with people who aren't seeing things necessarily the way that this film shows us so clearly. So, yeah. Well, I think we're closing now, and I don't know if we have Sam, if you want to lead us out right now.
I was gonna say that Jeremy, maybe we can, for those who can stay on for another 2 minutes, we can do a quick trailer of The Power of Local. I think it's a great follow-up to this conversation, to actually see that there's so many amazing things happening on the planet, that these doomsday narratives, well, they have some place. We can't be overrun by them, and there's still a lot. I think, particularly, I would say in the global South, I feel very hopeful. There's a lot that we can do, and so maybe that let's watch the film, the trailer. I invite you to stay on for 2-3 more minutes with us. And it's been great to be with you, Jeremy and Rutendo. And thank
you. Yeah, it's been great conversation.